Okay, so this is going to be a video response for Tyler James Berger, as well as anyone who may be convinced by Jordan Peterson's ideas about Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death and terror management theory. So, Tyler, you start out by saying that the denial of death fueled your belief that religion is an illusion. And you also show Jordan Peterson claiming that Becker thinks that the idea of God is some infantile delusion or denial. That's simply a misreading of Becker. Becker, who, by the way, was a believer in God, what he claimed is that our only chance at solid meaning is to look at the cosmos and its magnificent processes and to attribute meaning to it. Basically, that's the idea of God, the idea of meaning in the cosmos. To take that leap of faith, basically, that Kierkegaard talked about in attributing meaning to the cosmos. And then, since we are part of it, to, by extension, attribute meaning to our lives. That's our only chance at solid meaning. He talks about how the kinds of meanings we get from our current culture, like, putting a rubber ball through a hoop or something, are insufficient, either from the perspective of our actual requirements for meaning or our requirements for death anxiety suppression or our requirements of sheer rationality, because at some level of our rational mind, we know that these are flimsy sources of meaning. So that's Becker's perspective. Then the idea of hell not being compatible with death anxiety suppression, because hell is an anxiety producing idea. Well, that can be countered once again with the explanation that we have to account for evil in the world. In other words, you may try to create a religion that gives you immortality. You may postulate a loving God, but you have to reconcile that with evil in the world. And so in order to reconcile those ideas, you postulate the notion of hell and, burning eternally in hell and so on. Notice the idea of eternity even in hell. And also notice that a lot of religions do tend to describe the things that get you into hell as things of the flesh, the sins of the flesh and so on, which, once again, that also is linked to Becker's distinctions between the symbolic self and the animal self that he talks about in The Denial of Death. Then the argument about fate's worse than death, somehow refuting the influence of death anxiety. Well, this doesn't make sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Remember that in evolution, it's not enough for something to be influential or apparently influential if it doesn't exist in a potent enough or pervasive enough quality or quantity. In other words, death happens to every single organism. Avoiding it is one of the main motors of evolution. Survival and reproduction. If you don't survive, if you die, you don't reproduce. So you need to avoid it. If you die, you don't do anything. Fates worse than death are not as pervasive. Similarly, I could give you another completely different example in evolution of something that is more pervasive, having a greater influence, even if in some ways it's not as potent. For example, if you have a bird with a twisted beak designed to extract seeds out of a particular pine cone, but there happens to be some other source of food in the environment that requires a straight beak, and that happens to be more nutritious than the food in the pine cone, that doesn't mean that the bird is going to have a straight beak necessarily, because if there are only a few of the sources of food that require that straight beak, evolution is still going to tend toward providing the bird with a twisted beak that allows it to avoid starvation by accessing the majority of food sources in the environment, which are those pine cones, right? So, evolutionarily, the fact that there are fates worse than death does not have the same type of influence, especially understanding that it is reproduction and survival that are the two main motors. I repeat, you die, you don't do anything, including reproducing. So that's crucial. That has to have a stronger evolutionary influence. So that takes care of the argument about fate's worse than death. Then the notion that suicide is worse than death. Okay, here once again, in addition to the argument I just made, is the notion that there's a subtle distinction that has to be understood, that it is not death itself that humans are afraid of. Becker doesn't claim that, because we don't know what death is. What we are afraid of is our perception of death, whether conscious or unconscious. That's what we're afraid of. That's what the organism is trying to avoid, its perception of something that prevents it from surviving and reproducing. That's a subtle distinction that you have to look into. And so, to counter that perception, the organism, in the case of humans, generates a symbolic sense of self. And so, self-esteem is this symbolic sense of self, basically living up to the standards of whichever culture you happen to subscribe to. And if you do not live up to those standards, if your self-esteem is slow, if it's not sufficient to provide you enough death anxiety suppression, then you may very well commit suicide, because the death anxiety day to day is unbearable. Okay? You are pursuing death because in reality, it is death anxiety that really is the source of pain, the source of avoidance. Death itself, actually, comparatively speaking, we understand at some level, is not the same as the death anxiety that we're trying to avoid. So that is something you have to think about. Our defense against death doesn't necessarily even have to be pragmatic. They even have this distinction, just to go a little bit on a tangent, in terror management theory between proximal defenses and distal defenses. In other words, if I tell you cigarettes give you cancer and you die, I show you the warning. If you think about it pragmatically, maybe right now, as the thoughts are conscious in your mind, you'll say, okay, well, I will only smoke one cigarette, or whatever, I will not, because I don't want to die, right? However, if you wait a certain amount of time and the thoughts become unconscious, what they found in the studies is that now you apply symbolic self-esteem defenses toward that death threat. And you'll end up, for example, if smoking is part of your identity, let's say that in your country, everybody smokes. Well, in my country, we do this and we're strong and everybody's got to die someday. So you'll come up with a self-esteem cultural answer to death, whereas before, when death was more conscious, you might have applied a more pragmatic response. And we even have, now we're starting to get in the evidence some neuroimaging studies showing that there is in fact a part of the brain that simply cannot predict death when it comes to the self at the unconscious level. And what is hypothesized, and once again, this is just starting to develop the neuroimaging science of terror management, is that death anxiety suppression may be transferred to other areas of the brain that are more subject to self-esteem processes that can deal with the anxiety in a different realm. Um, and here we get into the issue of evidence. You talk about complexity and how you think that's what's driving things. Basically, I will call it complexity salience theory. Um, However, there's no evidence to support that theory. I mean, tell me of a single complexity salience study. These are just conjectures. Terror management theory has about 1,200 studies to this date for the last 35 to 40 years. That's a substantial body of evidence. So, the idea of complexity driving the whole process may be appealing to you, but there's no evidence to back it up. And from my perspective, doesn't really make sense. It's part of the picture, but it doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem nearly as compelling as the notion of death anxiety, neither from a purely hypothetical ideological perspective, nor certainly from the ideas we can ascertain from evidence. Another thing that Jordan Peterson claims is that Becker does not mention Jung in the denial of death. I mean, get the PDF of the denial of death and put Jung. You'll find lots of entries that Becker talks about Jung a lot. So Becker, is simply really going into Jung and Freud and a lot of these folks in a particular chapter, for example, and Peterson seems to be completely ignoring that. So that's simply false. And then Peterson also claims that Becker himself claims in the book that he didn't understand anything Jung wrote in Alchemy. Well, just put the word alchemy, put the word Jung, and try to see whether you find that in the denial of death. It's not there. This is a fabrication by Jordan Peterson. Okay, you also say that Becker claims we cannot confront our mortality to any extent, whether through psychedelics, stoicism, and so on. Once again, you misunderstand Becker. Becker does talk about, a manly confrontation with death. He talks about how we have to confront death without any illusions. He, of course, does mention how it is impossible to face up to the full awesomeness and terror of the universe without any defenses, that you can only increase your confrontation. You can't completely leave yourself exposed. But the notion that he doesn't believe that we can confront it, I mean, that's simply false. That's simply a misreading of the book. Now, as for psychedelics, I mean, I'm sure you know that it is a very intense experience. I myself have done it, and it's not something you can do every day. I mean, the confrontation with mortality, with the awesomeness of reality that you may encounter through psychedelics, is not something that is very easy to do, especially depending on the intensity of the trip. And so we have to admit our limitations. Yes, you can confront death. You can confront the awesomeness of reality. You can get away from the narrowness, the narrow focus strategies of our culture, which basically you get very focused on small things rather than a more expansive view of reality. You can get away from that to some extent. And Becker does talk about that, talks about fetishes, talks about narrow focus strategies for the long part of the book. How to expand our vision. How can you deny that he says that? That's a huge part of the book. But he also, of course, does say that we have to be aware of our limitations, that not everything is possible for humans. Stoicism, I mean, he does talk about stoicism. He talks about, things that can, of course, allow us to confront death to a larger extent. So, I think you just have to read Becker more thoroughly and understand that your attribution of certain arguments to him is simply incorrect. Now, you also mentioned Ram Dass, and to get back to the idea of psychedelics, he himself talked about, Ram Dass, how psychedelics may give you a bit of a vision, or may be able to give you a vision of a larger reality, God, confrontation with death, but that you couldn't really stay there. He always talked about that. And so, ultimately there were certain movements toward embracing meditative practices and other things that would allow you to do so more consistently. And yeah, I absolutely have no doubt myself that that is possible, and I have no doubt from reading Becker that he believed that as well. But he will tell you, and I think the evidence backs it up, that there are limitations to this, and we have to accept our limitations as well as our possibilities.